It stayed with me until a day about, let's see, the 80s, the late 80s.
The coded messages, the bloody shirt pieces, the masked attacks. For 44 years, the Zodiac Killer haunted California and evaded capture. Now investigators claim a breakthrough that changes everything. They found a man whose name creates a hidden message when removed from the killer's ciphers. His gun collection was scattered before his death. His neighbors lived in fear. His own wife suspected him but was too terrified to speak. When she finally did, her words changed everything. It all goes back to December 20th, 1968. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were on their first date. They were good kids. David was an Eagle Scout and school leader. Betty Lou was an honor student. That night, they told Betty Lou's parents they were going to a festival. But there was no festival. Around 11:20 p.m., a driver found them shot to death at a gravel turnout on Lake Herman Road. It was a well-known lover's lane. Their lives ended before they could even start. 6 months later, it happened again. July 5th, 1969. Darlene Ferrin, 22, and Michael Mageau, 19, were in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs Park. Just after midnight, a stranger shot them with a 9mm pistol. Darlene died. Michael survived, even though he was badly injured. He remembered the man was short and very heavy, at least 195 pounds. Then came September 27th, 1969. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing near Lake Berryessa. A man appeared wearing a black hood with a white crossed circle symbol. He tied them up, said it was a robbery, then stabbed them both. 6 times for Brian, 10 times for Cecilia. He even wrote on their car door with a marker, listing all the dates of his attacks. Brian lived. Cecilia didn't. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, the killer struck in San Francisco. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver, picked up a passenger in the city. In Presidio Heights, that passenger shot him in the head. This time, the killer didn't run off quietly. He tore off a piece of Stein's bloody shirt and sent it to a newspaper to prove it was him. By then, the letters had already started. On July 31st, 1969, 3 newspapers in California received strange letters. Each one came from someone calling himself the Zodiac. Inside each envelope was a piece of a coded message, 408 symbols in total, split between the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times. The message came with a threat. If the newspapers didn't print the cipher on their front pages, he would start killing over the weekend. Panic spread fast. Police were scrambling. So were readers. But the biggest shock wasn't what the killer wrote. It was who solved it. Donald and Betty Harden, a schoolteacher couple from Salinas, sat down with the letters. They had no special training, no FBI tools, just sharp minds and patience. Betty had a hunch that the word kill would show up in the message. She was right. That guess helped unlock the pattern. In just days, they cracked the entire 408 symbol code. But what the message said was even more disturbing than the threat. It didn't reveal the killer's name like he promised. Instead, it said, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." The note compared hunting humans to wild animals. He even referenced The Most Dangerous Game, a short story where people are hunted for sport. The message ended with a strange jumble of letters. No one has ever been able to explain that part. The FBI and CIA had also tried to break the code. They failed, but 2 teachers from Salinas beat them to it in less than a week. That stunned everyone, and it proved one thing. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer. He wanted attention. A few months later, In November 1969, the Zodiac mailed another puzzle. This one had 340 characters. It looked even more confusing than the first. For 51 years, nobody could solve it. Not the FBI, not the best codebreakers. People from all over the world tried. All failed. Then, in December 2020, 3 men finally cracked it. David Oranchak, Jarl van Eyck, and Sam Blake, an American, a Belgian, and an Australian, used computers and math to figure it out. They discovered that the cipher used diagonal patterns and odd spelling tricks to confuse readers. What did it say? "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me," it began. Then he mocked the idea of going to the gas chamber, saying it would just send him to paradise. He claimed he'd have slaves in the afterlife. It was dark, twisted, and cold. But once again, he didn't give his name. The FBI confirmed the solution in December 2020. It didn't bring justice, but it brought answers and more attention to the case. The Zodiac didn't just write letters, he sent threats, drawings, bomb plans. One time, he mailed a detailed diagram of a bomb meant to blow up a school bus. Another letter came with a cipher called Z32 and included a map. The instructions talked about radians and inches from Mount Diablo, a clue only someone with mapping knowledge would even understand. He also sent the Z13 cipher with just 13 characters after the words, "My name is." Many hoped this one would finally reveal who he was, but it was too short to solve, and many now think he never planned to tell his name anyway. His letters always circled back to one idea. Humans were the ultimate prey. He said killing was more exciting than hunting wild game. He quoted, "the most dangerous game," again and again. His words didn't just scare people. They made schools shut down. Parents kept their kids home. Police took the threats seriously. But no bomb was ever found. And yet, his writing kept getting darker. To this day, 2 ciphers remain unsolved: the Z13 and the Z32. The Z13 is short, only 13 characters, but still a mystery. The Z32 came with that strange map, and may be linked to a bombing plan or even Donna Lass's disappearance. French engineer Faisal Ziraoui claimed to have found clues using the same method that solved the 340-character cipher. He thinks it points to a spot near Lake Tahoe. Others say the codes might be fake, that they were meant to waste time, or scare people, or throw off police. For over 10 years, a team of over 40 experts, former FBI agents, cops, military vets, forensic pros, and journalists, worked non-stop to solve the Zodiac Killer case. They weren't guessing. They were chasing leads all across California. They went through old crime reports, rechecked ballistic and forensic evidence, and interviewed people who were ignored for decades. They even hiked deep into the High Sierra, looking for buried weapons based on tips. Every hour of work had one goal: prove that one man, Gary Francis Post, was the Zodiac Killer. They didn't start from zero. They started with Post and worked backwards. Every piece of evidence was compared to him. Shell casings, fingerprints, even DNA from his old clothes and family members. Even when police departments refused to hand over key DNA samples, this team kept pushing. They uncovered new crime scenes and widened the Zodiac's map, from San Diego all the way up to Lake Tahoe. Then they found the photos. Poste had a dark room in his home. Inside were hundreds of pictures, but one thing stood out: scars on his forehead, deep and clear. These marks matched the ones seen in Zodiac police sketches from the 1960s. Post got those scars in a brutal car crash back in 1959. a crash that killed another airman. The scars stayed with him until he died at 80. According to the case breakers, the shape, size, and placement of those scars weren't just similar, they were identical. They called the match irrefutable. For the first time, there was a face with physical proof that lined up with the infamous killer's image. But there was more. At Lake Berryessa in 1969, the Zodiac attacked a couple. Military-style boot prints were found near the scene, size 10.5. Post wore that exact size, not just in theory. Photos of him confirmed it. And he wore military boots. He'd served in the Air Force, so that detail wasn't random. Other Zodiac scenes had the same type of prints. On top of that, a paint-covered wristwatch found at another murder scene matched Post's background. He'd worked for decades as a house painter. Boot size, job, habits, it all started lining up. And then came the ciphers. The Zodiac didn't just kill. He mocked police with puzzles, cryptic letters, anagrams. For years, no one could figure them out. But one investigator on the team, Jen Buchholz, a former Army counterintelligence agent, tried something different. She removed the letters in Gary Francis Post from one of the Zodiac's ciphers. What came out was a hidden message. It only worked if you already knew Post's name. According to the case breakers, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a signature move, like Post left a secret for only someone with the right key to find. Still, that wasn't the most chilling part. Before Post died in 2018, he reportedly told at least 6 people he was the Zodiac Killer. Not just rumors, actual confessions. 3 of those were written down in sworn court affidavits. Neighbors, friends, even one person who claimed Post tried to groom him into becoming a killer. The darkest moment came when Post's own wife supposedly told neighbors she had always suspected him, but was too scared to speak. Gary Francis Post was born on November 8, 1937, in the quiet town of Potsdam, New York. His father, Glenn, was 27 at the time. His mother, Elva, raised him alongside 2 siblings. Nothing about his early years hinted at the darkness that would follow. He grew up in a sleepy, snow-covered town near the Canadian border, known more for colleges than crime. It was the late 1930s, and America was just pulling out of the Great Depression, only to be thrust into World War II. Life was hard, but Gary's childhood seemed ordinary. That's what makes the rest of his story so disturbing. As a young adult, Gary joined the United States Air Force. That's where things took a sharp turn. He wasn't just another recruit. He received advanced training in codes and ciphers. Military code-breaking techniques from his era were later found in the Zodiac Killer's letters. He also worked as a radar technician, mastering complex calculations, map reading, and pattern recognition. These weren't common skills, and they eerily matched what the Zodiac was doing with his letters. He also learned how to go undetected, studying communication and surveillance systems, giving him the perfect cover for something far more sinister. In 1959, everything changed. Gary was 21 and stationed near Rockville, Indiana. One night, drunk and riding in a Jeep with another airman, they slammed into a railroad tunnel wall. The driver died instantly. Gary survived, but just barely. His skull was shattered, his face destroyed. Doctors feared he wouldn't make it. He spent weeks in the hospital undergoing multiple surgeries. They had to remove all his teeth. He wore dentures for the rest of his life. Deep scars formed on his forehead, scars that matched the Zodiac sketch. After that crash, people close to him noticed something else. Gary became cold, moody, sometimes violent. It was the kind of change people didn't understand back then. But now, it raises red flags. Then came the transfer that would isolate him completely. The Air Force sent Gary to Thule Air Base in Greenland, just 750 miles from the North Pole. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, there was no sunlight for months. There was nothing but snow, radar screens, and silence. That kind of isolation breaks a person. His colleagues said he came back different, distant, paranoid, cold. Even the boats that carried airmen there were called Zodiac boats. Some believe that's where the infamous name came from. And what Gary brought back with him wasn't just frostbite. It was something darker. In 1970, as suddenly as the Zodiac killings stopped in the Bay Area, Gary moved to Groveland, California, a remote one-road town in the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 150 miles from San Francisco. He left the city behind just as the Zodiac vanished. To many investigators, this timing was too perfect to ignore. Gary never left Groveland again. He died there in 2018, but his name wouldn't die with him. When Gary moved to Groveland, he married a single mother. From the outside, it looked like he had settled down, but neighbors later revealed that the marriage was a sham. They never shared a bedroom, never kissed, never held hands. It was a cover. His wife eventually confessed to neighbors that she had long suspected he was hiding something, but never had the courage to go to the police. By day, Gary painted houses. In fact, he once painted the home of Clint Eastwood's mother. But at night, he allegedly ran a secret group, a posse of young men who followed his every order. Locals described them as loyal, secretive, and dangerous. Gary didn't just teach them to paint. He trained them in violence. He took them into the woods and taught them to kill. They slaughtered animals for fun. One story claimed he set up salmon hooks to bleed bears out while he watched and laughed. Another said he taught them how to make explosives, pipe bombs strong enough to level homes. One former member said Gary ordered a man to be shot and killed at a lake in the mountains. That case is still being investigated. The idea that he wasn't just a lone killer, but a leader of violent young men, makes this story even more terrifying. Gary's control didn't stop there. He allegedly targeted local police. When a new officer moved into town, rocks would fly through their window. Every single time. It wasn't random. It was a warning. Some officers quit and left. Others stayed quiet. Gary's posse also lent guns to suicidal people and intimidated anyone who crossed their path. The town lived in fear. Nobody dared challenge him. All the while, he painted houses, smiled at neighbors, and blended in. Gwenny grew up in Groveland, California, in the house right next to Gary Francis Post. She was just a little girl in the 1970s and 1980s when Post and his wife started babysitting her. At first, it felt normal. They were friendly neighbors, but very quickly, things took a dark turn. Post didn't just babysit, he trained her. He would take her deep into the woods 5 times a week and teach her how to shoot guns, not once or twice, 5 times a week. She was just a child, and it wasn't fun. It felt strange, and it scared her. Behind closed doors, Post showed a side that Gwenny says still haunts her. He was cruel to his wife, Mary. Gwenny remembers how Mary was forced to sleep on the couch while Post walked around like a king. He had 2 faces. In public, he smiled. In private, he controlled, screamed, and frightened. Gwenny now believes she spent her childhood next door to the Zodiac Killer. In 2018, she had a phone call with Mary, who quietly said, "Gary is a very bad man, and I'm sorry I didn't tell the cops about what he has done." That single sentence broke Gwenny. Suddenly, everything made sense. Chris Avery was one of the young men Post pulled into his strange world. He called them his posse. At first, Chris thought Gary was just a tough outdoorsman. He even said Gary had a great side. But soon, Chris saw what that meant. Post didn't hunt for food. He killed for fun. Bears, deer, otters, ferrets. He didn't just shoot them. He played with the bodies. Chris said Gary seemed to enjoy the blood. And worse, he trained the boys around him to become like him, teaching them how to survive, how to hunt, and how to kill without feeling anything. Chris only realized years later how twisted it was. He said Gary had no conscience. Michelle had a different kind of nightmare. She was the common-law wife of Post's son. They were together for 10 years and had a child. But when the relationship ended, her life turned into hell. Gary Post didn't just get angry. He sent his posse after her. They smashed her windows, damaged her car, even attacked her. She had to leave California just to stay alive. Even after Post died in 2018, some of those boys kept coming after her. They still listened to Gary's voice, even from the grave. Michelle said the psychological pain was worse than the bruises. Gary may not have murdered her, but he destroyed her life in his own way. Years after those babysitting days, Gwenny had one final conversation with Mary. It was a quiet phone call. Mary was now old, living in a care home. But her words changed everything. She said, "I'm sorry that I didn't tell the cops about his Zodiac past." That was it. Nothing more. But for Gwenny, it was the last puzzle piece. That one line was an unspoken confession. Mary had known all along, and she had kept the secret. Gwenny felt sick. Not just because she believed Gary was the Zodiac, but because people around him might have helped hide it. On purpose, or out of fear. The most terrifying story comes from a man named Will. He was just a teenager when he joined Post's posse in the late 80s. At first, it felt like an adventure, but very quickly, it became a nightmare. Will said Gary could kill anything, anytime, without blinking. Wild animals, pets, anything. And he made others do it too. Will said Gary once hung meat in trees and nailed hooks into the trunks. He'd trap bears just to watch them bleed. He'd sit in a lawn chair and laugh. He needed to kill. It wasn't about survival. It was about feeling power. Eventually, Will got scared enough to confront him. He asked if Gary was the Zodiac. Gary didn't deny it. He attacked Will with a 5-pound hammer. That night, Will ran. He never looked back. He went into hiding and stayed hidden for years. Even now, the memory of Gary Post still terrifies him. In 2016, something shocking happened. Gary Francis Post, 78 years old, was arrested for domestic violence. He had allegedly pushed his wife down the stairs. Police took him to Tuolumne County Jail. For a man once suspected of being the Zodiac Killer, this wasn't just another arrest. It was a disturbing turn in a life already full of dark mystery. The Zodiac case had remained unsolved for nearly 50 years, and now Post was back in the justice system. Not for cryptic letters or random murders, but for an act of violence at home. It was personal, and it was brutal. Many began to wonder if this late-life crime was another glimpse of the same rage that had terrified California in the 1960s. But Post never stood trial. After the arrest, doctors checked his mental state. Their findings were clear. He couldn't understand what was going on. He didn't know why he had been arrested. He couldn't help his lawyers. The court ruled him mentally incompetent. He was sent to a state hospital in California, where he spent the rest of his life under psychiatric care. It was a strange ending for a man some believed to be one of America's most elusive killers. He had mocked the police for decades with codes and riddles. Now, He could barely speak or understand simple things. Justice, if ever due, would never come. Gary Francis Post died on August 23, 2018. He was 80. He passed away at St. Joseph's Medical Center. The cause of death was long and grim: sepsis, septic shock, trouble swallowing, and dementia. He also had high blood pressure, weak bones, a slow thyroid, and irregular heartbeats. His final days were painful. This wasn't a peaceful death. It was slow and full of suffering. Afterward, his ashes were scattered in the Sierra Mountains. For a man wrapped in so much mystery, it felt like a symbolic end, his remains disappearing into the wild, just like the Zodiac had vanished so many years ago. But even in death, Post left behind questions. In his final years, Post started giving things away. Not money, not clothes. He gave out guns, bullets, and over 1,000 shell casings. He handed them to people he liked, people in his community. Most didn't realize what these gifts really were. There were parts of pistols, bags of gunpowder, and bullets from 25 different calibers. Some were hidden in closets. Others sat in basements for years. This wasn't just a collector cleaning house. It felt like something more. Maybe a message, maybe a legacy, maybe guilt. Whatever it was, the scale of it was chilling. And these gifts could now be the missing pieces that finally prove what many have suspected for decades. After Post died, things got serious. A team called the Case Breakers, former cops, military men, and forensic experts stepped in. They found the stash. They boxed it all up and sent it to labs in 3 different states. These labs began testing everything: shells, guns, fingerprints, and DNA. They even compared old police sketches of the Zodiac to a photo of Post from 1963. The scars on his forehead matched. The Case Breakers believe they're close. Very close. They say this evidence might finally prove Gary Francis Post was the Zodiac Killer. But the FBI didn't buy it. In fact, their response couldn't have been clearer. The San Francisco field office said the FBI's investigation into the Zodiac Killer remains open and unsolved. That wasn't a soft denial. It was direct and final. They refused to give more details, out of respect for the victims and their families. But their message was clear. This mystery was not over. Not even close. The Case Breakers went further. They said Post also killed Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside in 1966. But the Riverside police quickly shut that down. Officer Ryan Railsback said there was no link. "We don't know how we can be any more clear." They even mentioned a 2016 letter where someone admitted that an earlier note tying Bates to Zodiac was fake. A hoax. Just a sick joke. The police still offer a $50,000 reward for real answers. That case remains wide open, and Gary Post is not part of their theory. Tom Voigt, who has spent 25 years researching the Zodiac, was blunt. He called the Case Breakers' claims hot garbage. He told Rolling Stone there was no real evidence, just attention-seeking noise. One of their biggest arguments was that Post had scars on his forehead, which matched the Zodiac sketch. Voigt crushed that idea. He said no witness ever mentioned forehead scars. The lines were added by the artist, not based on real sightings. If Post had scars, Voigt argued, that actually makes him less likely to be the Zodiac, not more. It flips the theory on its head. There's another detail that adds mystery. In 2017, a year before Post died, San Francisco police actually looked into him. They even visited him in jail. That's rare for such an old case. But they stayed quiet about what happened. They never said if they talked to him, what they found, or if they ruled anything out. That silence says a lot. It means they didn't get enough to act. But they were curious. Still, nothing came from it. No charges, no public conclusion.